Good day, everyone. I would like to welcome. Oh, thanks, Karen. Forgot to mention that. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Mitch, the EDUCAUSE ITSMCG. I'd like to welcome you to today's online book club. We'll be reviewing and discussing the book ITIL Practitioner Guide. The session is being recorded and will be available on the ITSMCG wiki site within 5 business days. So look for that. This is going to be kind of just a casual conversation about the book, what your impressions were, some big aha moments you got out of it. But I would like to kind of put a little framework around it. So what I suggest is as we follow this format that we discuss each chapter in order. I think there's 6 chapters, so we should be able to go through them pretty easily. Contribute with 3 main ideas: what you liked, what you didn't like, and any aha moments. And I would take consideration and think about some of the topics that were posed throughout the month. We had a topic of the week that we sent out, and then consider especially the questions from the author that was sent out in yesterday's update, and we'll go over them again in case you didn't have that. Before we get started, let me introduce Stuart Rance, one of the authors of the book ITIL Practitioner Guide. We're extremely delighted that he took some time out of his day to join us. So thank you so much for taking some time out. I know you're not local here either, so it's really appreciated. Stuart, would you like to say anything about the book or any other opening remarks?
I've got lots. I'd say it was a very interesting book to write because I've co-authored a lot of things over time, but this one we did in a very unusual way because it was much more collaborative than many of the other things that I've worked on. So when you get to especially things like the sections on value, on the guiding principles, all of the early stuff, there is not one person's writing there. There is bitter arguments and discussions and contributions. I remember sitting in a bar in New York with Kai Markaru and Kevin Bear for hours arguing about guiding principles one night. And out of that, we distilled stuff that I'm really proud to have been involved with. Something else to be aware of, which you might find interesting, I don't know if you're all aware, but there will be a new version of ITIL released probably early next year. It will be called ITIL 4, and a very core part of it is going to come from this ITIL Practitioner publication. So a lot of the ideas in ITIL Practitioner are much more recent and up to date than some of the other ITIL content, and will be coming through to the core of the basics of ITIL for the next version.
Yeah, as part of that journey with Akshay and Axelos, I'm excited to hear that they've kept a lot of the practitioner guidance and some of those other frameworks, including in the ITIL update. So I'm excited to see that carry on in the new version. Well, great. Thank you for joining us and being part of this discussion. Pull up my notes here. So there's 5 basic questions that Stuart provided, just to kind of germinate, give you some ideas. So we're asking, is the book just relevant for IT services, or can it be applied to all other parts of services? Are all the guiding principles of equal importance, or are there some that may be more important than others? And how does it change with context? Are there additional guiding principles that you want to add based on your own experiences? And what metrics and measurements do you see? How do you measure them? And what behaviors do these measurements cause? So why don't we start it up, just open it up to the floor. Why don't we start with chapter 1? And I'll just leave it open to you guys to chime in. What were some aha moments? What did you like? What didn't you like?
I can ask some questions to get you started if you like.
Okay. Yeah. Just like I said, we're very informal here. We just want to talk about the book. So
a lot of IT organizations that I work with focus almost exclusively on outputs. What did we deliver? And very, very, very few think about, let alone measure, outcomes. What did the customer get as a result of us delivering that IT? And I'm quite interested to know how people feel about that, whether that's your experience of IT organizations, of seeing how IT runs, or whether you know of other organizations that do focus on and measure outcomes.
Hi, this is Andrea from Morgan State University. Our organization, I wouldn't say is super mature in ITIL, and we're moving through that right now, kind of getting started. And I would say spot on with that. We are sort of in the old way. We're not looking at value creation and things like that, measuring outcomes. But we're starting to move in that direction. So I agree with you there, at least in my organization. That's how we are.
This is Mojgan Amini from University of California in San Diego. And I work in the central IT department at the university for all the enterprise systems and infrastructure, et cetera. And what I've noticed, I've been there for about 13 years now and have had 3 different leaders. So chief information officers leading the IT on campus. And I've noticed that each one has kind of brought their own priorities and so and how IT operates. So whereas one would be very operation focused and reactive and making sure, things are running, in my recent experience, it's all about being more proactive. And so that leads us to measure everything, because you can't improve when you don't measure. And that's where we are now, and it's exciting. It's not easy because you got to find what to measure first, and then measure it, and then go back and improve.
Let me share some measurements from a couple of organizations that I've worked with. One of them I can tell you who they are because I've been in a joint presentation with them where they've talked about it. Jaguar Land Rover, they make cars. The key metric is we get 4 cars off the end of the production line every minute. The key measurement for IT is we get 4 cars off the end of the production line every minute. IT focus on, is there anything we are doing that could reduce the chances of getting 4 cars off the production line every minute? And that is what everybody focuses on, everybody thinks about, and that's the outcome that they measure and report. And anything that IT does that has a detrimental effect is reported in terms of how many minutes were there where we didn't get 4 cars off the end of the production line and how many cars did we lose. I find that really powerful.
Now, how would we relate that to higher ed? Where we've got so many things going on campus. We have the student teaching and learning. We may have other activities happening on campus like football or, whatever it is. Like how would we boil that down to something that we could use in higher ed, do you think?
I think that's a really good question, and I'm going to try and turn it back on the people on the call, because that's what we mean when we say you should be measuring IT in terms of outcomes and not outputs. That somebody needs to be sitting down, and maybe you are supposed to record every lecture and make it available online within 5 minutes of the lecture ending. I'm guessing that's the case. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think that would probably depend on the school and the faculty.
Yeah, but that's the sort of thing that I've seen being measured in other universities. I don't know the US university environment well enough to know what's important. But the thing is, to think about what IT is being used for rather than what IT is delivering, and then to get some measurements of that. So that's my challenge to everybody on the call. Come on, give me an example of something that your customers are using IT for that you could conceivably measure.
How about submitting grades?
Absolutely. So,
yeah.
Go on.
No, I was just going to say, the systems that take in grades that faculty, the IT systems that faculty use to submit grades need to be available, especially at those times when grades are due, and they have to be 100% accurate.
And that's a great example. If you could come up with a metric for, percentage of grades that weren't able to be submitted, or number of minutes delay in submitting grades, and that's exactly, so when this book talks in the abstract about measuring outcomes and not outputs, that's exactly what it's talking about. You don't measure the uptime of the grade submission system. You measure could they submit the grades on
Yeah.
time?
Yeah.
And you might have metrics like, Wi-Fi coverage in the student dorms or something. I don't know, because I said I don't know what's important to your customers. But what I find is that when people start thinking about the difference between outcomes and outputs and go and talk to their customers about it, they can usually come up with some fantastic metrics where it completely changes how the customers see IT, because they stop getting reports all about IT things and they start getting reports about the things they actually care about. And then you can engage them in a conversation.
So I'm gonna ask something because it's kind of quiet in this room. So it has to do with measurements, but I love the last part of the last question about measurements and whether or not they change behavior. So unlike Land Rover, where you've got a corporate structure where there's, a mentality of you comply with the process because it's part of your job, right? And there's that expectation there. There's not so much of that expectation here in higher ed, especially when it's very federated, and we try to motivate people by desire, and congeniality and adoption. So driving behavior by enforcing metrics or changing behavior by enforcing metrics is a very slippery thing here.
It's interesting. And what about within your IT organizations? Is that still the same? Do people measure what they're doing and report it?
It is by, but we don't necessarily here anyway, not by I think the key people that are the most effective in changing staff behavior, and that's usually their direct report or their manager, the people
Right.
that they directly report to.
So I cannot remember who it was that once said to me, if you make somebody's continuity of employment and their pay rises dependent on a metric, they will achieve that metric even if it destroys the organization.
Yep, yep. The watermelon effect.
Well, yeah, or even worse than that. It would be like, sorry, when I talk about football, I'm talking about soccer, but I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the game of soccer. Can you imagine if the manager of a soccer team decided that they wanted to increase the number of minutes that their team was in control of the ball? So they said to each player, maximize the number of minutes you're in control of the ball, and that's what you're going to get paid for. What behavior you get out of your team and whether they'd win anything.
Just a bunch of ball
Because
huggers.
although you want the team to maximize the number of minutes, the worst thing you want is any individual player to adopt that goal.
Right. The Kobe effect.
Yeah, and we're bad in IT at doing that. And then we wonder why we get dysfunctional behavior.
Yeah, I've noticed in my monthly report, I'm getting small changes. Like I think I've been doing this now about 6 months, and I'm adding different statistics. Some are just kind of interesting, FYI. This is how many tickets we had in a month. What areas were the most popular, so that we can try to focus on those in our documentation or our website. But I think I'm
Interesting.
going to start, looking at, how I can put our report in terms of what the impact is on people. Like for example,
It's so powerful.
yeah, I think that'll tell sort of a story as to why it's so important. Like one of our self-service, it's a big website that we have where people can enter grades or they can register for classes and so on. And that was like down 3 times this month. And so I kept track of it because I thought this will be an interesting statistic. And now that we're talking, I think instead of saying it was down 3 times, I'm going to say this is the total amount of time that people couldn't, enter grades or register for classes or something like that. So yeah, I appreciate that thought. Thank you.
I'm just looking up, I have forgotten the name of this guy. Hang on, see if I can find it. There's a very useful law. It comes from the finance industry, Goodhart's law. Anybody ever come across Goodhart's law? So he's an accountant, finance, economics. Sorry, he's an economics professor. I say an accountant. Goodhart's law says that when your measurement becomes your goal, it ceases to be a useful measurement. To have a measurement that you look at for trends and for understanding and for thresholds to take action is good. But as soon as that measurement becomes somebody's goal on which they are rewarded, it stops being a useful measurement because people start gaming it always. It comes from economics, but it applies in IT. It applies everywhere. As soon as you give me a goal and tell me that's how you're going to reward me, I'll make that number come good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very interesting that a law from an economics professor is so relevant to another field like ours.
Yeah, I find that very interesting.
And we like measuring things. We're techies, we're IT people, we understand the numbers, but they're very dangerous.
I think a lot of us, other people probably resonate with this. We're really good, especially the service management team, and if you've got a really robust tool, like we use ServiceNow, very powerful in reporting, can generate beautiful reports, a lot of data, great presentation, but sometimes it kind of stops at that, and people aren't doing anything with the data in these reports to understand trend and to drive continual improvement.
Waste of time then, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's come back to metrics later. Shall we have a chat about chapter 2, the guiding principles one?
Great. Yeah. Let's do that.
I have to say, of the entire book, this is my favorite chapter. I'd be interested in what other people think of these principles, whether anybody follows any of them as a matter of, well, of course, that's what I do.
I wish I could say that, like making sure that, the customers determine the value. I think sometimes in my organization, we have a habit of, knowing what's best, so to speak, and we don't talk to our people enough. So that's something that really hit me home. And I also really liked, sort of the permission to view processes and actions, in terms of the number of steps needed. We're always been doing it the same way. We shouldn't change it. I thought, well, yeah, there's probably stuff around here that we could really take a look at, crack it open and go, do we really need to do all this? Can we boil it down? So that's something, those are two things I took away that I really enjoyed in this chapter. And I think I made action items for myself in these areas.
That's nice.
This is Mojgan again. I really appreciated having these principles spelled out and upfront. Because the best part is you can kind of point back to it, you refer back to it, or you point people to it. Now, as far as what we kind of leverage or kind of adopt here, I think the first one that jumped out at me is doing the progress iteratively. Because it's always been a 1-year project, 2-year project, 3-year project, and it's just drags on, things change, and so we're moving towards a more, iterative, just put it out there and then improve it and come back around. So that one jumps out.
That's interesting. So some of my customers still use waterfall projects for their IT projects. Not many, but there are still some. There are none who are still using big, long-term 2- and 3-year IT service management projects. When I first was engaged in IT service management 20 or 30 years ago, a typical IT service management project would last at least 2 years, would involve putting in new tools, sending everybody on training, documenting new processes, and out of that 2 or 3 year project, the initial value would come after 2.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
There is no place where that is appropriate anymore. It's just the world has moved on. I can understand why some very unusual IT projects might still need to be quite long-term, very rigid. I guess if you're going to build a new nuclear power plant and you're designing the IT to support it, it's a long, slow, careful project with very well-defined requirements and so on. And you don't want to learn from failure and so on. But there's nothing in IT service management where we can't guarantee some value in the first 8 weeks, regardless. I don't care if it's a huge thing that you want to do in total. You can do something quickly that will create some value for somebody, and then you can build on it.
Right. But it really makes a difference if the people on the project have that mindset, because that's where you get stuck is, especially at the university, like somebody else was saying, I think it was Mitch that was saying, there are, teams and groups and committees and consensus and being nice to each other. And if people have always worked that way,
Yeah.
you wait for the next meeting to talk about it, and then you wait for the next. So we're trying to shift that into deliverables, short deliverables, put it in front of people. But it's like a big change management effect, organizational
Yeah.
change management.
So one of my customers had a problem situation where all of their permissions on their files and folders and services and everything were assigned to individual users. And they knew that they would be more reliable, more secure, and things would work better if they worked on permissions assigned to groups and nothing assigned to individual users. But they'd put off doing anything for 2 years because they were too scared of the risk of breaking everything. And I said to them, why don't you do it in an agile way? And they said, well, we can't. And I said, why not? And they said, well, because we might break everything. So we just said, look, next time you get a new joiner, create a group for their role, give the permissions to that group, assign them as the only person in it, and see if it works. That is a step. It will create some real value. And then once that was working, we said, right, now take other people in the same role, move them into that group and take away their permissions one at a time. It's very easy. And then we did another group and another group. And within 12 months, we had group-based permissions on very low risk, incrementally with value added at each stage. And they found some things that weren't working right and went back and learnt and improved. And it's just that matter of thinking, how can I do this thing iteratively? You don't need to design it all in one go. Yeah.
Yep. One of the things that we're trying to communicate is ITSM more as a discipline than a project.
Yes.
Because a project implies it's going to end. I mean, the definition of a project is start and end. So this is more about a discipline. It's more about a way of thinking about things and a way of doing things. So then it just becomes kind of a rolling iterative roadmap, as opposed to we're going to do ITSM.
I love it. I think you're exactly right. So a couple of my customers have now taken these guiding principles and printed them out on large sheets of paper, the sort of thing you get on a flip chart pad, and stuck them up on the walls of their meeting rooms. And at the beginning of planning meetings, they remind themselves of them and talk about them for a few minutes. And then as they come to have to make decisions, it really works. Somebody says, but look, if we want to collaborate, if we want to keep it simple, if we want to start where we are, then we have to, it really works very well.
So hearing you say that, do you think it's most effective to take, I mean, all of them make sense and it's hard to argue with any of them, any of the guiding principles, but every environment is a little bit different. And we kind of embarked on creating our, IT service values. I guess we call them values, not guiding principles. And we came up with 4 because of where we were in our, the situation we were, right? We want to make sure customer service is good, so we had something about that. So, do you recommend like picking a few and saying this is what we need today, this year to focus on?
So what I recommend doing is using this as a starting place, talking with your teams and saying what's important to us now. And yes, you might use a subset of these, or you might come up with completely different ones because these aren't quite right for you, and that's not a problem. What's important is you establish ways of working that they defuse a lot of arguments having principles like this, because instead of, I prefer this way, you prefer that way, you get to know, well, which one does keep it simple and focus on value, which really helps. But I'm intrigued to know which 4 you had. Gone?
Sounds like you'd have to sign an NDA for that.
All right.
Maybe this is on mute or something. Why don't we, since for the sake of time, why don't we move on to, I think the next chapter is CSI. Is that right?
Yes.
I don't have the book in front of me, unfortunately, so yeah.
Yes, it is the CSI approach. So.
Oh. No, I was going to say, this was one of my favorite chapters because I think sometimes we forget to do continual service improvement. I think we launch a big service management initiative, and then we kind of like have a big party at the end, and then we wipe our hands, clean, and then we move on to the next project. And I love how, because the CSI book in itself from the ITIL version 4, or version 3, excuse me, is a very big, very weighty, kind of a heady kind of subject matter. And I think this does a good job of kind of making it more on the practitioner level. Anything you want to comment on that, or from the rest of the group?
I was going to say, I really liked the CSI register, and I went ahead, I got to start small. I can't absorb, the whole chapter, but I thought that's something I could do today. And so I made one. I haven't shared it with anyone yet, but that's something I'm hoping to just collect that data, use, our Google Docs and keeping track of them, and then, looking at it every month to see, what we can do now, what we can do in 6 months, a year, that sort of thing. So I'm kind of excited about that.
I absolutely love it. And, you don't have to have one. You can have a personal one, you can have a team one, you can have a global one. It depends on who's making decisions and who's financing stuff. You can literally have a personal one that you never share with anybody that is your own effectively development plan.
Do a lot of organizations share these registers with users and let users input this? Or is that more of like a customer service survey where it might have a question about what?
I have a couple of customers a couple of clients of mine that share these with their customers rather than with their users, with the decision makers. One of the big global logistics companies with 3 letters in their name, there's quite a lot of those, so I haven't told you who it is. I can think of at least 4 of them offhand. And this one, I helped them put together a CSI register many years ago. And what would happen then is I used to go in for about 2 weeks every year and see how far they got and work on creating the next year's sort of outline plan of where they were going to go, and we assigned ownership of all the big areas to people, and then I went away and they would work over the year on the various initiatives that we'd identified. And what was interesting is about 4 or 5 years later, this company was owned by a very, very big conglomerate of whom you won't have heard. And the conglomerate decided to put all their IT out to tender, and they came into my client, looked at what they were doing and said, we're going to no bid this one, we can't do it as competitively. And that made me feel really good. And that was just as a result of having kept the CSI register going for 4 or 5 years that kept people focused on continual improvement.
This is Anne, and I kind of always use CSI as my little toolbox for any type of process I'm implementing.
Yeah, it makes complete sense because,
yeah.
Go on.
It's just from the perspective of, once you get something set up, then I will put it in the CSI register as, okay, check back on this in X amount of time. That's kind of how I use the CSI register, because right now we're kind of at a low maturity level, so everything is kind of new. So just kind of use the little tools for CSI to get that up and running, and then my CSI register is kind of, okay, this is up and running, here's the time frame to come back and look at it and start poking and saying, is it still working? Is it still giving the outputs? Have things changed in the environment that we need to address? That type of thing.
I love it. And that's what continual improvement is all about. It's not just making things better, but it's also looking for, as you say, changes in the environment, changes in the context, things you've learned maybe that you didn't know before. The one thing I will warn you against with continual improvement, which I've seen done in 2 or 3 places, is making somebody responsible for it. because continual improvement is kind of a cultural thing that either everybody does or it doesn't happen. And if you have a CSI manager who owns continual improvement and it's their job, I've never seen that effective. Anybody else seen that?
So that's interesting. I'm listening to you. So in our organization, we're trying to make that mental shift of weaving in continual and CSI into just our daily work and everything we do, and just our own operations internally, the processes, as Anne was saying, that we follow. Let's make it better. Let's ask questions. And we did create a CSI program and put somebody in charge of it so that they can roll out at least like training and support and the
I've seen that done. To have somebody like a Scrum Master who's a mentor and a facilitator works well.
Yeah. So
but if they're responsible for making the improvements is when it doesn't.
Yeah. That makes sense. Got it. Yeah, so how we use the register, and I was excited to see it in the book because what we had was just a running list, and how we used it was, listen, we're training everyone to think differently, and we adopted Lean Six Sigma as our methodology. So we trained everyone on it, and we said, look around you. If you see something that's happening, it could be in some other units, it could be some other process that doesn't belong to you. But if you see something that's not effective or it's frustrating, put it on this, throw it into the pile so that it's noted. So put it on the list, and then basically we'll come back around and see, if we want to take that and use it as a improvement project, or so we're kind of telling people to just whatever they see, just don't ignore it. At least put it on this list. That's how we used it.
Yeah. To be honest, a CSI register can be as simple as an old-fashioned suggestion box, can't it?
Yes.
And it can help you be more transparent. But I do recommend sharing it with your customers, not necessarily with your users. And the reason I recommend that is because their priorities may not be what you think. And it's quite interesting if you share with the customers, these are the improvements that we got in the pipeline, when they say, well, do me a favor, focus on this one and this one, because that will really help us. That's actually very powerful.
Yeah, I can give testimony to that. One of my jobs is to run a working group, and we have our own CSI registry, and it's powerful when they see the requests that they're making be implemented, right? And us work with them to prioritize, and then show value in that we're doing something for the organization. It just kind of drives that adoption needle just a little bit further, right? I think nice segue to, I think the next chapter is OCM? Or is it
no, I think the next one's metrics and measurements.
Okay. Maybe we move metrics and measurements to the end, because I really want to talk about OCM.
About it a bit, yes.
Yeah, OCM or communication, whichever you prefer.
Well, communication's the next one in the book. Why don't we go there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you know what? I've just started writing the communication thing for the next release of ITIL. So, it's a big deal. Some of us, and I include myself as of when I was a techie, are not very good at communication. I once, when I was a very heavy techie, I was being taken out by a really senior technical person to look at a technical problem and to learn from them. And after we'd fixed it, I really learned a lot from this guy. He was very clever. And we went back in at the office, and our manager shouted at him and told him off because he'd really upset the customer. He'd done technically a good job, but he'd not updated the customer. He'd not explained what was happening. And after the manager had had a rant, this guy, and it was a guy, looked at his manager and said, "Don't ask me, I don't do people, I only do computers."
Yeah.
And I think we still have some people like that. And I don't think we should say those people can't be employed, but I do think we need to do something to help them not upset our customers.
This question is related to communication to the general audience here. Do you use communication group within your IT department to help you with service management changes and communicating like outages, planned or otherwise? How are you weaving communication? Because I think it is a skill set, Stuart. I think a lot of people aren't good communicators or don't know how to craft a good communication plan. So
Yeah.
What is the balance between everyone having to communicate versus getting a resource to help?
Good question.
We do have a communication team. But they help with maybe the high impact or the large kinds of changes and communications out to campus and not everything. So it's a balance.
They do marketing as well as communication about things you're doing, as in,
yes,
understanding the customers and what they want and what they're worried about?
They do. Again, it's on, we have to pick and choose which ones are the most impactful to put them on. So they do with that as well. And they're all non-technical. They come from non-technical backgrounds.
Good.
So yeah, they ask good questions and they make it sound really easy to understand.
So what communication channels are people currently using? Phone, chat, email, Slack, social media of other sorts, notice boards? What's working at the moment?
I'll kick that off. I think that's a great question. I think higher ed, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues. We have a constituency group called the IT Communications Group, and they actually gave a wonderful presentation about how they use different methods and means to communicate. And the bottom line is people still are using email very heavily. But universities, Notre Dame is a good example. They have a very creative communication plan. They use big stickers that go on the floor to communicate things. They'll use digital displays, make use of a newsletter. So I think that the end goal is to use as many different means of communicating so it touches everyone in a way that they appreciate and that they'll be receptive to.
And I think that's important.
I know.
Go on.
Yeah, our communications team basically identified the audiences, the different audiences, and then the different channels for each of those audiences that they preferred. Because at a university, you've got, staff, you've got faculty, you've got students.
Yeah.
And so you communicate to each of them differently. And so for the students, I mean, we have, if there's going to be anything, and again, from a change management perspective, if there's anything that's going to impact them or they need to know about, then there's the Facebook page, and there is the Twitter, and there is a bunch of other things. From a faculty staff perspective, we have an opt-in alert email because that's how they like to do it. We also have different communities that have different committees that meet on a regular basis. And so if there's something that needs to be put in front of a certain community, then we make sure that there is a presentation at that particular meeting. You ask to get invited, you tell them, and then give them all of the, information and places for additional questions. And you give them that action to please go out and spread that among your community. And that has been, given the vagaries of a university environment, that has been successful.
What I'm hearing and also seeing in the chat on the session here is that I suspect you are way ahead of a lot of my other customers as an industry in how you communicate with your users and your customers, because it's something that many IT organizations are quite poor at. And they don't understand what you were talking about using different channels for different audiences because they have different expectations. I'm very encouraged by what you're saying.
Well, there might be a correlation there between why and how we use communication, and the first challenge presented in the beginning of this talk, and that was the unique position we are in higher ed, where
Yeah.
we have to be collegial and we have to be, help with adoption and use these soft skills to drive change.
And actually, do you know what? That brings us beautifully as a segue into organizational change management.
So let me start. I absolutely have to say that I did not know what OCM was until, one, when I read the book, and two, when I joined USC. Where I was at prior, we just rolled stuff out, especially in IT. We just expected us to know how to use it because we're all IT professionals, right? We know how to use Skype. We know how to use this widget.
Yeah.
But I tell you, since taking some ProSci training, our organizations really embrace OCM at a big level, and I've really seen some noticeable improvements just within a short time that I've been involved in OCM. So great chapter. I'm glad that ITIL and this book really took a concerted effort to talk about OCM. So.
I'll tell you in a minute why we thought that was an important chapter to put in, but I'm curious to, what about with other people? Is everybody brought into this, or are you an exception?
So we kind of tried it, well, when we're rolling out services or changing services, we bake it into the service design / project. And so we always have support center and communications as project participants from the beginning. And we always look at it from the customer's point of view in terms of, so we just recently rolled out two-factor against a bunch of applications. And from an organizational change, I mean, this was significant from the perspective of now you have to do something else in order to get to what you want to get to, which from a user's perspective is annoying. So how to be able to communicate that change and then get acceptance on that was something we spent a lot of time on. And so when we rolled it out, we had a pretty high acceptance rate. And
That's
we
good.
didn't have, a deluge of questions into the support center. And by having the support center there, and that's our help desk, we also started to say, okay, we have faculty travel, and the way we had set up a certain process was that you pretty much had to be in the United States in order to authenticate. So what do we do for those people who are traveling and are not there? So we already had that built in, where if you are, not in the United States and you need to do X, Y, and Z because you have to get to something, you call the support center, and we had a process set up so that they could help them and get them taken care of. So, as a whole, nobody loves it, but everybody is doing it.
That's interesting. So, in case you're interested, the reason we added this was because as a team, the people who put this book together had noticed that most of the failed IT projects weren't technical failures, they were people failures. We'd either got the wrong requirements, which this doesn't fix, or quite often the technology did what it was supposed to do, but the users just carried on. So, one of my customers, for example, introduced a whole new CRM system for managing all their customer communication, but the salespeople ignored it and carried on using email because that was what they were used to and that was what they knew. There was nothing wrong with the CRM system, but there was no engagement at the level of this is the value it can bring to you, and this is how you can get that value, and this is why you should change from what you're doing to what you're going to do. It was just, here it is, get on with it. And I've seen lots of failed IT projects for same reasons, that the end users don't understand why they would want to use it, so they don't. And that's why we put this chapter in, because of the value focus of the whole book.
So I'm curious from an organizational change perspective, because I think something that we've all experienced, but I didn't necessarily see called out, was the, I guess, passive-aggressive where somebody doesn't want something and works against the project, you know, from different angles.
Yeah, we see that all over. Especially, you know, you're trying to introduce a new way of doing change management into IT. So, yeah, people will say yes, but changing their behavior is a completely different thing, isn't it?
I think sometimes when people hear OCM, they think, oh, I need to include training. But if someone just chatted that they took the ProSci training, they know, anyone's taken OCM training, they know that it's just a part of the overall change management. So it's doing it properly. I think that's the key.
Right. And I think that, I mean, all of the guidance that you're given is that you need upper management engagement, and that you need certain things, which in a university environment are kind of hard to come by. You know, if you're in the commercial environment, it's, you know, all right, this is what we're going to do. The CEO says we're doing this, and, you know, you're doing it.
Don't believe a word of that.
Well, no, I know. There's always pockets of, but at least you've got that leadership, not even from a, you know, gonna do it. It's a, here's why we should do it, you know, because there's all types of leadership.
Yeah.
But I find it from a university environment that it adds a layer of complexity.
Often the faculties are effectively independent, are they? The different schools.
Oh, yes.
And therefore you might roll out something expecting them all to use it, but 3 do and 4 don't.
Well, the other challenge too, Stuart, is that especially at a private institution like USC, the schools are more independent because they have their own money, and so they can hire their own IT, buy their own services. So why should the schools take advantage of centralized services when they can do it either better, cheaper, faster? So, you know, you have for example, we have 5 different storage devices, storage options, service offerings for faculty and staff, where I think in Land Rover, they probably use one storage solution.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you manage that? Are you better, faster, and cheaper than what they can buy by taking their credit card to Amazon Web Services?
Yeah, no, I don't, unfortunately not.
So, you know, then we get back to portfolio management, which is outside the scope of this publication, but that's the thinking about where your value is greater and where maybe you do need to partner with others to get the services, but I'm not going there.
So we have a few minutes left. There are some questions that we'd like to ask you, Stuart. So
Please do.
The one burning question I always like to ask this of authors is, what did you wish you would have? What did you want to include in the book that got left out, or you know, along those lines? What do you wish you could have included that you didn't? Along those kinds of things.
Yeah, I would have loved to have been allowed to include some stuff about very specifically security and availability management, not as processes, but as thought areas. I think what is written in the existing ITIL books about availability management was fit for purpose in the 1990s, and we manage IT very differently now. You know, a typical IT system is rarely 100% available to all of its users, and frankly, it's rarely 100% unavailable to all of its users. And we have this model that says we measure uptime and downtime. And I would have loved to have got some stuff in here around what availability, in the metrics chapter probably, what availability really means and how you measure it and report it and talk about it. And with information security, again, the stuff in the ITIL books is way out of date, and it is very much tied into organizational change management, into communication, into principles, into how do we get everybody in IT and all of our users and all of our customers working together to protect the organization. And It's more cultural stuff than anything else, and it's hard. But I was overruled because it was much too techy.
So, as an author, such as yourself, what 3 books would you recommend us to read? What would be the next 3 books we should be reading?
Gosh, it kind of depends on where you're going. I love the DevOps Handbook. Are we all familiar with it?
The Phoenix Project?
No, the DevOps Handbook.
Okay, I think that came out after the Phoenix Project, right?
It
Wasn't
did,
that
well
like,
after.
yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, if you haven't read the Phoenix Project, go away and read it. That's a brain dead. And the goal on which it's based. Do you know the goal?
Oh, The Goal. Yeah, I read that book.
So that's one by Ellie
Okay.
Goldratt, and the
Yeah.
Phoenix Project was then based on that. So the goal in the Phoenix Project, the DevOps Handbook is a more prescriptive how to do DevOps, but if ops people don't read it, it's a disaster because I'm sick and tired of ops people telling me the DevOps people don't include us. And, it's DevOps, right? You include yourself by picking up the ideas around flow, around feedback, around, how you manage and automate. And, it's not for somebody else to engage you. You've got to do your own DevOps, not get somebody else to do DevOps to you. So, going away to read the DevOps Handbook is a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of operational people who think it's aimed at developers. And when you read it, it kind of is aimed at developers. You have to translate it into how can I do this in my world? I'm just looking up on my bookshelf. I've stood up to have a look. What would I really recommend? I have this book that I really love, but it's a hard read. Here we are. Can you see that?
Thinking for a change. Yeah.
This is, are you familiar with theory of constraints?
Mm-hmm.
Theory of constraints is the main ideas behind the goal and the Phoenix Project and behind the whole DevOps movement. And it's around how you manage systems. And by systems, I don't mean techie stuff. I mean systems of things, whatever they are. So, economics is a system. The world economics is a system. And theory of constraints is around how you, and this particular book, Thinking for a Change, putting the TOC thinking processes to use, is one of the hardest reads I've read in the past few years. It's around serious tools to help you make decisions and to help you think through how to achieve goals. I love it. Hard read, but an inexpensive book, but well worth the effort if you've got the energy to force yourself to read it and do the exercises and think about it and work your way through it.
Well, thank you so much. This actually, we're about out of time, so this concludes the online book club. I want to thank the book club organizers, Andrea and Joseph, who could be here with us today. But for putting this together, this book club, a special thanks to Stuart for taking time out to participate in this discussion. Finally, a shout out to Karen for hosting the online book club. Stay tuned for more exciting events. If you want to see any past recordings, we have our wiki page, so refer to the ITSM wiki page for all the latest information on upcoming events and past recordings. We're always looking for new ideas for webinar, online book club, or anything else. Just to let you know, we're looking at a Verisum book club coming up, so hopefully we can get that out for you guys in the next couple of months. It's a pretty big book, but we think that'd be a good online book club. But if you have any other ideas for a book club or anything else, just feel free to reach out. If you're not a member, consider joining us. There's a link in the chat to our wiki page. It has instructions on how to join our CG. The transcripts and recording will be available within 5 business days on the ITSMCG wiki site. Again, I said it's a good place to look for upcoming events and past events. So thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It was great. I appreciate your time, Stuart. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.